There are words in the lexicon of history that have been stained forever by the events they came to describe. Words that were once innocent, even beautiful, that are now permanently bonded to acts of unimaginable cruelty. When we hear them, we don't think of their original meaning. We think of the darkness, the Holocaust, the Gulag, the killing fields. These are phrases that have become monuments to human suffering, shorthand for entire systems of industrialized brutality. But sometimes the most chilling words are not the ones that sound overtly sinister. They are the ones that maintain a veneer of cynical, mocking poetry. Words that twist the sacred into the profane, that use the language of creation to describe acts of destruction. They are the euphemisms of murder, the gallows humor of the executioner. And in the long, bloody, and complex history of political violence, few phrases are as strange, as specific, and as grotesquely ironic as the one we are going to explore today. It sounds at first like something from a romantic novel, a phrase that evokes images of civic virtue, of two hearts joined together not just in love, but in shared devotion to a noble cause. It speaks of a new kind of union, forged in the fires of a world remade. The phrase is the Republican marriage. But this was no sacrament of love. There was no church, no cheering crowd, no hopeful future. The only altar was the deck of a specially prepared barge. The only witness was the cold, gray winter sky. The only vow was the shared sentence of death. And the consummation of this union was not an embrace, but a final, terrifying plunge into the icy, fast-flowing waters of a river. This is the story of the mass drownings at Nantes, and how, during the most radical phase of the French Revolution, the Loire River was transformed into the national bathtub, a vertical flowing tomb for thousands of men, women, and children deemed enemies of the new republic. To understand how a revolution that began with the noble declaration of the rights of man and of the citizen could lead to priests and nuns being tied together naked and thrown into a river, we must first understand the context. We must journey back to the year 1793. France is in the grip of a national crisis. The revolution, which had begun 4 years earlier with such hope and promise, has entered its most violent and paranoid phase. King Louis XVI has been executed. The radical Jacobin faction, led by figures like Maximilien Robespierre, has seized control in Paris. France is at war with most of Europe, Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, all of whom are determined to crush the revolution and restore the monarchy. The economy is in chaos, bread is scarce, and paranoia runs rampant. The air is thick with rumors of foreign plots, of royalist conspiracies, of traitors hiding in every shadow. This period is known to history as the Reign of Terror. In Paris, the law of suspects has been passed, allowing for the arrest of anyone deemed an enemy of the revolution, a category so broad it could include almost anyone. The Revolutionary Tribunal works tirelessly, sending a steady stream of counter-revolutionaries to the newly invented, brutally efficient killing machine that has become the symbol of the age, the guillotine. But the terror was not just a Parisian phenomenon. The real savagery, the most uncontrolled and brutal acts, often took place far from the capital, in the provinces where the revolution faced its most dangerous threat, civil war. And nowhere was the civil war more bitter, more total, and more ferocious than in the region of western France known as the Valais. The Valais was a rural, deeply Catholic, and largely conservative region. These people were not, for the most part, political philosophers. They were peasants, farmers, and local artisans whose lives were governed by the rhythm of the seasons and the rituals of the church. They had initially been ambivalent or even supportive of the early revolution, which promised to lift the burdens of the old feudal system. But as the revolution in Paris became more and more radical, it began to clash with the deepest values of the Vendéan people. The first major break came with the civil constitution of the clergy in 1790. This was a law that sought to bring the Catholic Church in France completely under the control of the state. It required all priests to swear an oath of allegiance to the new constitution, effectively renouncing their loyalty to the Pope in Rome. Priests who refused were declared refractory priests and became outlaws. For the deeply pious people of the Vade, this was an intolerable attack on their faith. Their good priests, the ones who had baptized them, married them, and buried their parents, were now being hunted down and replaced by juring priests sent from Paris, whom they saw as illegitimate state functionaries. The final straw came in early 1793. The revolutionary government, desperate for soldiers to fight its foreign wars, ordered a mass conscription of 300,000 men from across France. For the young men of the Vade, the idea of being forced to leave their homes and die fighting for a godless government in Paris that was persecuting their priests was anathema. Riots broke out. The riots quickly coalesced into a massive, organized, and surprisingly effective counter-revolutionary uprising. This was the beginning of the war in the Vade. It was not a war of professional armies in neat uniforms. It was a brutal, dirty guerrilla war. The Vendéan forces, calling themselves the Catholic and Royal Army, were a peasant army. They fought with hunting muskets, pitchforks, and scythes, led by local nobles and inspired by their refractory priests. They fought with incredible ferocity, defending their homes, their families, and what they called Le Bon Dieu, the good God. The Republican government in Paris, the National Convention, responded with utter ruthlessness. They saw the Vade not as a political disagreement, but as a cancerous tumor on the body of the Republic that had to be excised by any means necessary. They sent their best generals and their most ideologically pure troops, the Blues as they were called, to crush the brigands of the Vade. The orders from Paris were chillingly clear. This was not to be a war of conquest. It was to be a war of extermination. General Turreau, one of the Republican commanders, famously wrote of his plan for the infernal columns that would sweep through the region. "My purpose is to burn everything." The convention passed a decree stating that the Vade must be destroyed. Its forests were to be cut down, its crops seized, its cattle confiscated, and its people exterminated. It is in this context of total, genocidal war that we must turn our attention to a specific city, the city of Nantes. Nantes was a major port city on the Loire River, a strategic gateway to the Atlantic. It was a Republican stronghold, an island of revolutionary fervor surrounded by the hostile, counter-revolutionary countryside of the Vade. Throughout 1793, as the war raged, Nantes became a key battleground. The Vendéan army besieged the city but was repulsed. The city's prisons began to swell with captured Vendéan fighters, refractory priests, and thousands of ordinary men, women, and children suspected of being royalist sympathizers. By the autumn of 1793, the situation in Nantes was at a breaking point. The prisons were horrifically overcrowded. An estimated 10,000 to 12,000 prisoners were packed into spaces designed for a fraction of that number. Typhus, which came to be known as prison fever, was rampant, killing hundreds every week. The city was running out of food. The guillotine set up in the main square was working daily, but it was too slow. It was an artisan's tool of death, capable of executing one person at a time. The problem facing the Republican authorities in Nantes was an industrial one. They had a surplus of prisoners, a surplus of enemies, and they needed a more efficient, a more industrial-scale method of disposal. Into this tense and desperate situation strode a man who would become the architect of the city's horror. His name was Jean-Baptiste Carrier. Carrier was a lawyer by training and a fervent, radical Jacobin. He was sent from Paris to Nantes in October 1793 as a representant en mission representative on mission. These were men invested with the full, absolute power of the National Convention, sent to the provinces to enforce revolutionary law and crush all opposition. They were, in effect, temporary dictators with the power of life and death. Carrier was a man perfectly suited to the brutal task ahead. He was described as a fanatical, unstable, and cruel man, utterly convinced of his own righteousness and utterly without pity for those he deemed enemies of the Republic. He arrived in Nantes, surveyed the overflowing prisons and the slow pace of the guillotine, and declared, "We will make France a cemetery rather than fail in its regeneration." Carrier quickly decided that the traditional methods of execution were inadequate for the scale of the problem. The guillotine was too slow and too public. Firing squads used up precious ammunition needed for the war. He needed a new method, something cheap, fast, and capable of eliminating hundreds of people at a time. And he found his solution in the great, dark river that flowed through the heart of the city, the Loire. The plan was diabolically simple. Carrier and his loyal cronies commandeered a number of flat-bottomed barges, or gaubers, which were normally used for transporting goods along the river. They then had carpenters modify these barges. They cut a series of trapdoors or hatches into the hulls of the boats, which could be opened from the deck by pulling on ropes or levers. These modified barges became known as noyades, from the French word noyer, to drown. The process of the mass drownings, which Carrier chillingly called vertical deportations, began in November 1793. The first victims were a group of 90 refractory priests who had been held on a prison ship in the harbor. One night they were told they were being transferred. They were loaded onto one of the specially prepared barges. The barge was towed out into the middle of the Loire, into the darkness, away from the prying eyes of the city. Then the executioners on deck opened the trapdoors. Water flooded into the hull, and the barge, with its human cargo locked below, quickly sank. Carrier wrote back to the convention in Paris, reporting on the event with a piece of grim, revolutionary poetry. An event of a new kind seems to have occurred. 90 priests are said to have perished in the river Loire. What a revolutionary torrent the Loire is! This first drowning was a success from Carrier's point of view. It was efficient and it was quiet. He now had his method and he began to apply it on a massive scale. Over the next 3 months, through the brutal winter of 1793 to 1794, a series of mass drownings took place in the Loire. Night after night, groups of prisoners, men, women, and children were taken from the city's prisons. They were bound, often in pairs, and herded onto the death barges. The barges would be towed out into the current, the hatches would be opened, and hundreds of souls would be consigned to a watery grave. The executioners, often members of a brutal revolutionary militia known as the Company of Marat, would use sabers and pikes to kill anyone who managed to break free and cling to the sides of the sinking vessel. The total number of victims is impossible to know with certainty, but most historical estimates range from 2,000 to as many as 5,000 people deliberately drowned in the Loire on Carrier's orders. The river became choked with corpses. Bodies washed up on the banks for miles downstream, poisoning the water and terrifying the inhabitants of riverside villages. The fish became so contaminated that a local ordinance had to be passed forbidding people from eating them. The Loire, once the lifeblood of the region, had been transformed into a vast, open-air cemetery. It is within this larger context of systematic, industrialized drowning that the specific and particularly sadistic practice known as the Republican marriage or le mariage républicain is said to have occurred. The accounts of this practice come to us primarily from the testimonies given at Carrier's trial after the fall of Robespierre and the end of the Terror. According to these witnesses, the Republican marriage was a special form of drowning reserved for certain victims, intended as a final act of ideological and sexual humiliation. The procedure was described as follows. A man and a woman, often a refractory priest and a nun, or a captured Vendean man and woman, would be stripped completely naked. They would then be tied together face to face, in a grotesque and forced embrace. This bound, naked couple was the Republican marriage. They would then be either thrown directly into the river to drown, or, more commonly, placed on one of the death barges with other victims to await their final, terrifying union with the cold water. Let us pause for a moment and try to comprehend the sheer, layered cruelty of this act. This was not just about killing. This was about ideological theater. It was a calculated act of desecration. The Catholic Church held celibacy for its priests and nuns as a sacred vow, a sign of their devotion to God. By forcibly stripping a priest and a nun naked and tying them together in a sexualized parody of a marital embrace, the executioners were committing a deliberate act of sacrilege. They were mocking the victim's faith at the very moment of their death. They were saying, "Your God is powerless. Your sacred vows are meaningless. In the new republic, we will marry you not to God, but to each other, and your wedding bed will be the bottom of this river." It was a form of symbolic violence as potent and as terrifying as the physical violence it accompanied. For secular victims, the symbolism was different but no less cruel. It was a final, mocking perversion of the most intimate human bond. It was a statement that even the union of man and woman, the foundation of the family, was now subject to the state's absolute power. The Republic gave life, and the Republic could take it away, and it could do so with a final, obscene joke. It was the ultimate expression of the state's power to dehumanize its enemies, to strip them not only of their lives, but of their dignity, their faith, and their very identity before consigning them to oblivion. How many Republican marriages actually took place? This is a question of intense historical debate. The image is so powerful, so perfectly emblematic of the terror's sadistic excesses, that it has captured the historical imagination. Some historians are skeptical. They point out that the stories come primarily from the highly charged atmosphere of Carrier's trial, where witnesses may have been exaggerating or repeating rumors to ensure his conviction. They argue that in the chaos and sheer scale of the mass drownings, such specific ritualized pairings would have been an unnecessary and time-consuming detail. For them, the Republican marriage is more of a powerful, enduring myth than a widespread practitia symbol of the horrors of Nantes rather than a literal common event. Other historians, however, argue that there is enough corroborating testimony from different sources to suggest that it did happen, even if it was not a nightly occurrence. They argue that sadism and ritualized cruelty are not uncommon features of genocidal violence. For a certain type of executioner, the act of killing is not enough. There is a need to humiliate, to degrade, to play with the victim before their death. For these historians, the Republican marriage was a very real, if sporadic, manifestation of the absolute power and utter contempt that Carrier and his executioners felt for their victims. Whether it happened to dozens of couples or to hundreds, the story of the Republican marriage serves as a chilling window into the psychology of the terror. It shows how revolutionary ideology, when taken to its absolute extreme, can create a moral universe where anything is permissible in the name of the cause. The people being drowned in the lore were not seen as human beings by their killers. They had been rhetorically transformed into something else: brigands, fanatics, traitors, vermin. They were an infection in the body politic of the Republic, and the lore was the national bathtub that would wash the nation clean. Once you have dehumanized a group of people to that extent, any form of cruelty becomes possible, even a cruelty that wears the mask of a cynical joke. The horrors of Nantes did not, and could not, last forever. As the military threat from the Vade was crushed, and as the political winds in Paris began to shift, the reign of terror started to consume its own. In July 1794, Robespierre himself was overthrown and sent to the guillotine. The terror was over. With its end came a demand for justice, a reckoning for the men who had perpetrated its worst excesses. Jean-Baptiste Carrier was recalled to Paris and put on trial before the same revolutionary tribunal that had once been his instrument of power. The trial was a sensation. Witness after witness came forward from Nantes to testify to the horrors they had seen. The death barges, the river choked with the dead, the terrorized city. And among the litany of atrocities, the story of the Republican marriage was told, shocking even a nation that had become accustomed to bloodshed. Carrier, for his part, was unrepentant. He defended his actions as a necessary evil, a patriotic duty to save the Republic from its enemies. He famously declared from the dock, "I did nothing but carry out the orders I was given. Everything is guilty here, even the President's bell." He tried to implicate the entire National Convention, arguing that he was merely the instrument of their will. But the new government needed a scapegoat, and Carrier was the perfect choice. He was found guilty of mass murder and of ordering the drownings. On December 16, 1794, Jean-Baptiste Carrier, the butcher of Nantes, met his end at the hands of the national razor, the guillotine. The story of the Republican marriage and the drownings at Nantes leaves us with a set of deeply unsettling questions. How can a movement dedicated to liberty, equality, and fraternity descend into such barbarism? It is a stark reminder that ideology, even the most noble-sounding ideology, can be a dangerous and dehumanizing force. When people become convinced of their own absolute righteousness, and when they come to see their opponents not as fellow human beings with different opinions, but as obstacles to a utopian future that must be eliminated, the door to atrocity is thrown wide open. The events in Nantes also serve as a chilling case study in the mechanics of mass violence. They show how quickly bureaucratic language can be used to mask horror. Carrier did not call it mass murder. He called it vertical deportation. He did not talk about drowning priests. He marveled at the revolutionary torrent of the lore. This euphemistic language creates a psychological distance, allowing perpetrators to carry out horrific acts while maintaining a sense of administrative, bureaucratic purpose. And finally, the specific, grotesque detail of the Republican marriage forces us to confront the role of symbolic violence and sadism in political terror. It wasn't enough to kill. The victims had to be mocked, their deepest beliefs desecrated, their humanity stripped away in a final, cruel performance. It reminds us that behind the grand political narratives and the abstract ideologies, the act of killing is often a deeply personal, deeply ugly, and deeply human affair, driven by all too human emotions like hatred, fear, and the intoxicating thrill of absolute power over another human being. The Loire River still flows through the city of Nantes today. It is a beautiful river, crossed by modern bridges, its banks lined with parks and cafes. But for those who know its history, its dark, deep waters carry a permanent chill. It is a silent, flowing monument to one of the most brutal episodes of the French Revolution, a reminder of a time when the national bathtub ran red with blood, and when the sacred idea of marriage was twisted into a euphemism for a final, cold embrace with death. What do you think about this story? Does the fact that this was done in the name of a republic and reason make it more chilling than atrocities committed in the name of ancient hatreds or religious fanaticism? And what does the specific, sadistic detail of the Republican marriage tell us about the psychology of those who wield absolute power? This is a dark and complex chapter of history, and I'm keen to hear your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. The goal of this channel is not just to recount these events, but to try and understand the human motivations and the social dynamics that make them possible. Your contributions are a vital part of that conversation. If you found this exploration into the dark side of the French Revolution and the psychology of terror compelling, I hope you will subscribe and enable notifications. There are many more such stories to uncover, shadows of the past that hold crucial lessons for our present. Thank you for listening.